Lesson covers Unit 4, Chapter 8 on Political Geography. These are a few essential terms associated with political geography. You should know the difference between a state, a nation-state, a multi-nation state, a multi-state nation, a stateless nation, and a landlocked state. It's actually less confusing than it initially seems. When we talk about a state, remembering in geography, state is synonymous with country. Never assume that a state means any state in the United States of America. Assume that a state is a country unless otherwise specifically stated. States are independent countries that have sovereignty over the land and people that reside there. A nation state is closely matched between the political sovereignty and an ethnic group. So a nation state is more homogeneous, meaning that the citizens generally identify themselves to be a part of an ethnic group that correlates. Multi-nation state is a country that's made up of more than one ethnicity. A multi-state nation is an ethnic group that is split into more than one country. And a stateless nation is an ethnic group that wants to be a country but is not. So they have a history of seeking sovereignty and seeking independence. And then a landlocked state is a country with no coast and it's entirely surrounded by land, specifically other states or countries. In addition, you'll want to know the difference between race, ethnicity, and nationality. So although this was talked about in the cultural patterns unit, you'll also see it connected to political geography. The concept of dividing people into populations on the basis of physical characteristics, skin color, facial types, and it usually results from a shared genetic ancestry. Now, you want to be really careful with race because race is a social construct. Technically, we all belong to the human race, but we have collectively, well, I shouldn't say collectively, we have organized ourselves, humans, into different groups on the basis of these characteristics. So, I'm not necessarily condoning the use of race. I'm just saying it is a social construct that we do have some concept of. Ethnicity is different from race. It involves a population whose members identify with each other through shared cultural traits and history. It's usually defined by ancestry, whether it's presumed or actual. That ethnicity can be subjective and very much can be interpreted or be held by an individual on an individual basis. Lastly, when we talk about the concept of nationality, that means belonging to a country through legal citizenship. You don't want to get the term nationality confused with nation. Again, I know that kind of throws things into the mix and makes things more confusing, but nationality is associated with an individual who has a legal citizenship within a country. Your textbook uses former President Barack Obama as an example of where an individual who's multiracial or has a unique experience may be identified very differently within each of these three identifiers. If we start to break these down as they correlate to former President Barack Obama, we can look at race. His mother was white, his father was black. So that would be the connection to race. Ethnically speaking, remember we also talked about this being subjective and up to the individual at hand that may identify this way. And so in this sense, Obama identifies as being African American. And so although many people may conveniently bring up the fact that he is biracial or half white, his experience has been that of an African American man, and so he does take on that ethnic identity. Looking at nationality, I mean, he's a U.S. citizen, therefore he is a U.S. American. So in that sense, nationality-wise, that would be his identifier. Important to note that more than likely your AP exam will steer away from concepts of race, ethnicity, and nationality just because it is so controversial given the world's history, particularly with colonization and people being stripped of their ethnic identity and their understanding of their connections to their ancestry. Can move on to boundaries, looking at physical boundaries, cultural boundaries, and geometric boundaries. So, if we're talking about physical boundaries, we're talking about mountains, rivers, deserts. These are physical, and they can serve to also separate different regions or areas and help kind of create these natural boundaries. Cultural boundaries, that is associated with borders that are based on cultural traits like religion or language. And then for geometric boundaries, these are boundaries that follow regular geometric patterns. They're usually straight lines without consideration for environment or cultural patterns. And so this is more so to do with our concept of political geography. These are human made boundaries. Mother Nature would not be able to see these boundaries or recognize these boundaries. They have been made by humans, and they often correlate to lines of latitude and longitude as well. Other geography terms you want to understand associated with political geography. So, antecedent, for example, has to do with pre existing features. So, commonly corresponds to physical features like rivers, bays, lakes, and mountains. Have your subsequent boundaries, and those are set after the settlements of different groups meet. It often corresponds to their respective ecumeny or um, settled areas. Superimposed boundaries, and these are imposed by an outside force like a treaty, perhaps. They may not reflect the existing cultural landscape. And lastly, you have the relic boundary, and these basically are no longer boundaries, but you can recognize them as being, previously existent. They're often the outcome of political changes. They're still visible on the landscape, but they don't necessarily carry any current significance or power. Have shapes of countries. So you'll want to know different shapes and what the benefits and shortcomings are. So for a compact state, they're round, they're easy for defense and communications along all areas. Some examples would include Belgium, Poland, Bhutan, and Hungary. The prorupted or protruded shape would be a round shape with a large extension like a panhandle that increases access to resources like water. Some examples would include Thailand, Myanmar or Burma, and Mozambique. You also have elongated states. And so these are long and narrow. They're difficult for communications to be had between different areas. Examples would include Chile, Italy, Vietnam, and Argentina. Also have fragmented states. And so this is where two or more areas are separated by another country or body of water. They're difficult for communications between areas. This would include the Philippines, Denmark, Indonesia, or Malaysia. These are often also associated with the archipelagos. And then we've got the perforated state, and those totally surround other countries. So, for example, this would include South Africa, which surrounds Lesotho, Italy, that surrounds Vatican City, and San Marino. And then lastly, we have our landlocked states. And this is where a state does not have access to water. Trade can be difficult because of the lack of ports. And this would include states like Bolivia, Laos, Rwanda, Paraguay, Serbia, or Switzerland. Examples here of states. So Cambodia would be compact, Thailand, perrupted, Vietnam, elongated, fragmented would be the Philippines, perforated would be South Africa. Map demonstrates what states around the world are identified as having a federal government or federal type system versus ones that have more of a centralized type of government. Um, Look at federal states, they often have power divided to more local areas. And so, because especially with states that are much larger, it is very difficult to be able to manage everything in all areas of that particular country. So, much of the power is actually going to be more localized, maybe in a specific province or territory that belongs to the overall state. Centralized governments, typically you have one overarching government that really dictates most of the laws. And so, these are more common in your smaller areas. To centripetal versus your centrifugal forces as well. And just keep in mind that centripetal is usually associated with unifying, centrifugal, something that can be a force that works against or can be dividing. And so, again, centripetal forces hold states together, things like nationalism, flags, anthems, strong government, that all correlates. I know that there often is this negative connotation with nationalism, but just to look at it in a literal sense, it's just some way of unifying a sense of of a nation within that country. And then they also share similar culture, religion, language, ethnicity, a shared past, sports, a compact shape could be good for transportation and communication. Centrifugal forces pull states apart. So, any kind of separatist movements, a weak national government, internal boundary conflicts, cultural differences related to religion, ethnicity, and language, and then physical barriers like being fragmented or elongated. Familiar with the concept of vulcanization and the breakup of the former Yugoslavian state. And we can also see here that much of it has to do with combination of ethnic differences, religious differences, conflicts. And so, anyway, I would go back and review that. And then for international organizations, you want to be familiar with supranational organizations like the European Union, international organizations like the United Nations, alliances between countries. So the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So that would be just those would just be some examples. And so then we can go to Rostow's 5 stages of growth, where we look at where countries are and how they may go through a natural progression as they start to develop more and more. So be familiar with those. You've got the stage 1, which is associated with the traditional society, stage 2, which is the transitional state, where countries start to specialize and build infrastructure. Stage 3, which has to do with industrialization, growing investment, regional growth, and political change. Stage 4, which is the drive to maturity, innovation, less reliance on imports, investment. And then stage 5, which is the age of mass consumption. So consumer oriented, durable goods, service sector becomes more prominent. Want to move on to classifications of your more developed countries versus your less developed countries. Now, I do want to, just put a statement out there that it is quite controversial to refer to countries as more developed, less developed. That does carry with it like superiority connotation or inferiority connotation. So I just want to put that out there. It might be more appropriate to use terms like developed or developing, but again, even then, it gets controversial. But either way, there is some distinction here. So, looking at more developed countries, they tend to have higher per capita GDPs, higher life expectancy, high literacy rates, high expected years of education, a high percentage of urban population, developed infrastructure, low birth rates, low death rates, stable population growth, low infant mortality rates, and high HDI rankings. For less developed countries, they have low per capita GDP, low life expectancy, low literacy rates, lower expected years of education, a high percentage of rural population, a little developed infrastructure, high birth rates, high death rates, unstable population growth, high infant mortality rates, and low HDI rankings. Of global economics, you're probably frequently going to use terms like core countries, semi-periphery countries, and periphery countries, and that gives it more of like 3 different categories. But again, using terms like first world, second world, third world is very outdated. You can see a map here of countries with the higher incomes that might be associated with being more developed, and countries with lower incomes that are often associated with less developed.